In the last part of this lesson, we considered Sorokin's work on cultural change over the evolution of, for example, Western civilization in terms of his two dimensions of sensate and ideational. But many authors have emphasized the issue of cultural persistence, i.e. that cultures don't change very much over time. And one person who's written about this is the French historian Fernand Braudel. And I've drawn up here a sketch of the Mediterranean. And Braudel says that if we look back in antiquity, there were three great cultural areas, that of Rome, then of Greece, and lastly the Phoenician world. And he says that these cultural areas have persisted down to the present. Only now these are the areas or regions of the Catholic religion, Roman Catholic, the Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox religion, and Phoenician, the world of Islam. And he suggests that therefore these cultural distinctions between these different regions have persisted from antiquity right up to the present. And another person who makes a similar point is Northcote Parkinson. Who says that back in the days of Alexander the Great, so back in 300 BC, there was a distinction made between the kind of independent, free-thinking Greek and the more servile Middle Easterners. And that has also persisted down to today. In Hofstadter's terms, he would say that in the Middle East, power distance is higher than in many European societies. So that power distance that we see today goes back at least to the time of Alexander the Great. And then the linguist and political commentator Noam Chomsky suggests that cultures and ideologies persist through time because the elites want it that way. They perpetuate ideologies that reinforce their own elite positions in society. And he suggests there are several mechanisms by which they do that, but it's basically based upon restricting access to views and opinions that conflict with the ideology that they want to perpetuate. So the examples he gives all kind of based on the modern world, but when we've put them up, we can sort of stand back and look and see how they could, basically apply throughout history. So he says that how the elites control ideologies and ensure the perpetuation of ideologies is their control of publication. So they own the newspapers and the printing presses. So they control what gets published. Also, for news, it always comes from ultimately government sources. So if you want to know what is happening in the world, it's come from government briefings, police news conferences. The government controls largely the flow of news and information. So it therefore reflects the government's view of the world. Also, he says the needs and agendas of advertisers are important. So, newspapers won't publish things that would put off their advertisers who they depend on for revenue. Or, you know, we know that, for example, in YouTube, it will be your video will be demonetized if you express opinions that are considered controversial, because then you won't have advertising on it. And also what we could describe these days as cancel culture. He doesn't actually use that term, but that's what he's talking about. The idea that opponents support an enemy, so they shouldn't be allowed to say what they believe. So they're supporting Hitler, they're Nazis. So their views are not just separate opinions, but they're actually a threat to our society. And the last point is that independent media is presented as scandalous. So, Twitter or X, it's scandalous. It's a source of misinformation. So discrediting alternatives to mainstream mouthpieces. So he says this is how the ideology, the values, the beliefs of a society are perpetuated from generation to generation, because they're controlled in this way by the elite, what people are allowed to believe. And we can see that this would be the same in the past. So the church in the past controlled what was published, because it was mostly monks who copied out manuscripts, and people would have relied in those days too on their rulers for understanding their broader picture of the world. And other powerful people in society, not necessarily advertisers, but powerful people, would cause problems for publications that went against the grain, and so on. Another piece of work that suggests the persistence of cultures is in an important paper called Regions Based on Social Structure. So let's write that up. So what these researchers did was they took hundreds of different cultures and they scored them on certain cultural dimensions, and they found that they divide the world into broad cultural regions. Now, if culture was changing all the time and changing quite arbitrarily, we would expect cultures to be quite mixed up and different cultures could be alongside each other. But that's not what they found. They found that within broad regions, the cultures are much the same. And that suggests they must remain the same over time to create these regions of similarity, a bit like what we saw with Braudel, and pointing out that the cultural regions within the Mediterranean today are the same as the cultural regions of antiquity. And what they actually did was then score these hundreds of societies on a whole range of different variables, and then did a factor analysis. And they found that what came out of that was two dimensions of culture. In their case, we've seen many different numbers of dimensions, from Hofstadter's 6, Trompenault's 8, and but they found two dimensions of culture. The first one is the unilineal bilateral distinction. So this is about ideas of kinship. In the unilineal approach, you belong to one lineage. It could be the lineage of your father or your mother, but you belong to that lineage. And whereas in the bilateral kinship, you'll recognise that you belong to both your father's and your mother's families. So in the unilineal approach, you tend to get clans, distinct clans. So if you marry into that clan, your children belong to that clan. They don't have any connection to your other parents' clan or family. So you get distinct clans. And with the bilateral approach, though, you get one of the features of that, no cousin marriage. Because you're related to your cousins, you're recognized to be related to your cousins on both sides. And so then they're not interested in trying to preserve the purity of a particular lineage. And a second feature, or the second dimension, is that of patricentric versus matricentric. So patricentric is where you follow your father's family, and matricentric is where you follow your mother's family. So a feature of the patricentric approach is these cultures allow polygamy. The father can have, multiple wives, whereas in matricentric cultures, inheritance is through the mother. So these are our two dimensions: unilineal, bilateral, patricentric, matricentric, and these are just some illustrations of the real world consequences of those sort of abstract cultural dimensions. Polygamy is a feature of patricentric societies, or you have to be patricentric to have polygamy. And then what they did was plot on these two dimensions the different societies. So we'll have unilateral, so unilineal, bilateral that way, that dimension, and this dimension patricentric, matricentric. And they found these broad regions. So the cultures of sub-Saharan Africa tended to be up here. The cultures of what they called the Middle Old World, so that's the Middle East all the way to East Asia, the Middle Old World, tended to be there. Then there's what they call the North Eurasia Circumpolar. Yeah. North Eurasian Circumpolar, so northwestern Europe, all along the top of Russia, and including into the north of America. And then lastly, if we could just use this colour again, the cultures of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, say, tended to be down here. So within each of these, there are lots of dots for the individual cultures, but they've separated them, or they separate into these different regions, or collect together into these different regions. And I've not listed all their cultures, but that's just 4 key ones. And one of the key things then is the continuity suggested by this, that they say even though the world has now been connected for 500 years and there's been a lot of contact between the West and other cultures, there is no sign of convergence. These retain their distinctiveness, suggesting therefore the stability and the persistence of these cultural differences. Each region keeps the traits that it has always had. There's so far little sign of the cultures coming closer together on these dimensions. And then they do an even simpler analysis, just looking at the unilineal bilateral dimension, and they find that with that, the world divides into two basic contiguous areas. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so here is the map of the world and its cultural regions that emerges from the paper Regions Based on Social Structure, looking just at the unilineal versus bilateral dimension. So in red is the region of unilineal cultures, and blue is the region of bilateral kinship cultures. And what we can see from this then is that there are these two great connected regions, not cultures kind of just mixed up randomly. So that suggests that they're not constantly changing and varying, as we've already said. There must be stable and persistent to allow these regions to emerge. And this is then the North Eurasia circumpolar region. Here is the Southeast Asia region, which is also the Pacific Islanders. So we can talk of a Pacific Ocean system which is connected to this North Eurasia system, circumpolar system. Those two are kind of connected there. And but they're also connected across the Pacific to the western side of America, whereas the rest of the world island here is all connected around the Indian Ocean, we can say, because we've got Australasia there, and all these southern part of the Eurasian subcontinent, so the Eurasian continent, connected there, and they're also seemingly connected to across the Atlantic to the East American system. So one thing we can say from this is it seems to be an illustration of the principle that land divides and sea connects. So these cultures are connected across the ocean to these cultures, and these cultures are connected across the ocean to these cultures, but the land divides those two cultures. And this is because travel by sea was always much easier than travel by land in ancient times. And so, you know, these are all connected by the coasts around them. But there's a land, the land divides these two cultures. Now, a couple of Russians, Andrei Korotayev, who we've come across several times, and a colleague have criticised this paper, or at least re-examined it, and come up with a somewhat different emphasis. So they make several key points we'll consider. Firstly, that they find that the patricentric, matricentric distinction or dimension is actually more conservative than this unilineal bilateral. So they prefer the patricentric, matricentric. They find that's better at distinguishing these regions. It changes less. And they also find, though, with that patricentric, matricentric distinction, or dimension, they find two macro regions, just like we've seen here. There's two great macro regions. But they find that the one with the patricentric, matricentric dimension, the two macro regions that emerge are connected to languages, connected to so the macro regions also correspond to two great language families, or language superfamilies, really. And as we've mentioned before, language and culture are very closely related. So we could, you know, expect to see this, that the cultures and the languages show the same kind of distinction, regional structure. And their last point is that whereas the authors of the original paper from which the data is taken, regions based on social structure, suggested that the uniformity within these regions is because of interaction between these cultures, so they influence each other. They say actually it's not because they're interacting here, it's because they have a common heritage. So it's started in a particular place and diffused out from there. So let's say they emphasize diffusion and therefore a common heritage, not interaction, as the source of these cultural differences. Now, to be fair, I didn't really take from the original paper that it was particularly emphasizing interaction. But anyway, the Korotayev and a colleague, they do make the point that it seems to reflect diffusion, a common heritage of all these cultures, rather than just that they're influencing each other in the here and now. And indeed, you know, the original paper says that despite interaction between Europe and other parts of the world, there does seem to have been little cultural convergence. So, you know, they themselves were making the point that interaction doesn't seem to cause cultures come together. But anyway, so whether this is really a disagreement or just a confirmation may be a moot point.